Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Colorado Broadband Office's Lunch and Learn series. Thank you for joining today's webinar featuring the United States Economic Development Administration. I'm Teresa Ferguson, Director, Federal Broadband Engagement with the Colorado Broadband Office, and I will be your host. The CBO's Lunch and Learn webinar series is typically held at noon on the fourth Tuesday of each month. We invite you to join our Lunch and Learn webinar series each month to hear about broadband technologies, funding programs, and success stories. You will find a list of upcoming events as well as past events at recordings on the CBO website. Today's session will be recorded and available at the Colorado Broadband Office URL cbo.com. All previous webinars are available on our YouTube page, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the Governor's Office of Information Technology and the CBO is technology and program agnostic, and this applies to all topics featured in the CBO Lunch and Learn series. A few logistics for today's webinar. To prevent background noise, please mute yourself during the presentation. We have allowed for sufficient time for Q&A following our speakers' remarks. You can enter questions into the chat anytime during the webinar. Please make sure that when you enter your questions in the chat, make sure they're for everyone so that we can all see them. And we will also provide you for an opportunity at the end of the presentation to unmute yourself and ask questions during the Q&A session. The goal of today's webinar is to provide the attendees with a thorough understanding of the USDA's, moved you to USDA, Trent, to the U.S. Department of U.S. Economic Development Administration's funding for broadband projects. We've invited Trent Thompson to talk with us in order to share his insights on how your community can partner with the EDA for a successful broadband infrastructure project. Trent Thompson is the Economic Development Representative for Colorado and Utah, and he is here today to help us understand and navigate the EDA Broadband Program. As you think of questions during Trent's remarks, please submit them via the web chat. I want to thank Trent for joining us today and for sharing his time and expertise. I'll now turn the webinar over to Trent. Trent, I think you have your slides as well, so I'll turn things over to you.
Before I share them, I just want to say thank you for having me. I don't mind being USDA. They have a great broadband rural program as well, so everyone should definitely be aware of that, because wherever we can partner, we want to, when it's possible. So I will move to sharing my slides. So you should, and I've got to do this now. Let's see. There we go. Can you see just the slides now? Okay. So thank you. And I am very much, I like to engage back and forth, but I also want to respect the process so that this can be used in future viewings. And so as we have questions, we will answer them at the end and go from there. My name is Trent Thompson. I'm the Economic Development Representative for Colorado and Utah. Just real quick background, I've been with the federal government my entire career. Started with U.S. Agency for International Development, working primarily on the Afghanistan program out of D.C. and in Afghanistan, and then moved to Colorado in 2010, worked for NORAD, U.S. Northern Command, primarily helping to coordinate for a really bad day like when we had September 11th. But in the meantime, we were supporting civil agencies like FEMA, and this is going to come into play in the presentation a little bit, for disaster response. And coordinating with the private sector and nonprofit organizations and coordinating and responding to disasters. And then started with EDA in 2016 as the Economic Development Representative in Colorado and Utah. And I do want to add, Janie Hackbarth is a new addition to the EDR team for Colorado and Utah. She started as a result of the CARES Act, which I'll get into a little bit later in the slides, about 2 months ago. And is the Deputy Economic Development Representative for Colorado and Utah. So she and I are your primary points of contact in working with EDA on any project related to a community's economic development priorities, let alone broadband, which we will get into. So with that, I will start on the next slide. The agenda for today, I want to, because I think bullets 1 and 2 are going to help lead into understanding better how EDA can partner with communities in broadband projects, the third bullet. So we'll start with talking about EDA at a broad level. I see that there are a number of folks here that I know well and have worked with closely before, so this may be somewhat information they already know, but there are other folks that I don't know that I want to make sure they're aware. And then as well, talk about then how to partner with EDA. Real quick, I think EDA is a Economic Development Administration, which is part of the Department of Commerce, is a unique agency, at least in my dealings in the federal government, in that we have, my position exists and Jamie's position exists to help work with communities prior to submitting a grant application with the agency. So where our job is to work with you from the very beginning of your community's priorities and helping to see how and what best ways we can partner with you to utilize your tax dollars to achieve those priorities. And then finally, we'll move into broadband projects themselves and talk about the types, talk about funding and what I'm hoping is probably the best case scenario for an easy way to partner with the federal government, which is never, that's somewhat of an oxymoronic statement, but there's reasons why it is. So we'll get into it. So next slide. Just at a broad, I guess, 5-mile overview, EDA is broken up into regional offices, and the Denver regional office is the one that I work in. The blue states that you see here are what are the 10 states that are covered in our regional office, and we're based in Denver. So while I have counterparts in all the other states in this area, the headquarters for our office is in Denver. The headquarters for EDA obviously is part of the Department of Commerce building in Washington, D.C. But then we report to them, but are in the field as much as possible. So there are EDA representatives in each of the states that are really working with communities day in, day out. Moving into what I think will be a needs to set the stage is our overall budget, how we are able to partner with communities through your tax dollars. Annually, EDA's average budget is $20 to $30 million. That budget is broken up into different types of grants that we can provide, and we'll get into that in future slides. But just as a reference point and as a scale point, $20 to $30 million is what we've historically seen. Now that can change between years, it can change between administrations, but right now that's about the average. Why it's important to kind of frame there is because our end of our fiscal year is coming up in the next 8 days, and Congress is still yet to pass either a continuing resolution or a full budget that would fund us starting October 1. So in 8 days, it's possible I may not be able to partner with communities until that budget is passed, but most likely a continuing resolution will come out of it. What's also important to note, though, and this gets into the comment I made about working in disasters in the past, the CARES Act that was passed in last spring, in April or May of this year. Just to kind of put into perspective, for the Denver regional office, EDA received $193 million just for these 10 states out of the CARES Act. I think it was total of $1.5 billion, which is again a drop in the bucket compared to all of the CARES Act funding, for instance, that SBA received for the PPP loans, which was in the $800-some billion. So, but the $1.5 billion that EDA did receive to allocate via grants still helps fill a gap that is desperately needed. That about 12 times the amount of our average budget was allocated last spring, and that only scratches the surface of the demand that's been that's arisen as a result of this national pandemic. The national federally declared disaster and the COVID pandemic that we are in now, that is unique for a number of reasons. One, normally when EDA works with communities because of federally declared disasters, it's a discrete disaster. It's a disaster in one area of a state. And it is also a discrete disaster in the sense that there's an impact and then that we're immediately moving into recovery. Both of those average things that happen with disasters aren't the case with the coronavirus. This is a national disaster. Every state in the country is affected. B, it is ongoing. It started this year, and it is probably going to last until a vaccine is safe and effective and distributed. And that means at least into next year and the economic impacts that have resulted from the disaster are going to be many years out. And so I mentioned that because the 193 million of that amount that EDA has been able to partner with communities on, half of that has gone to existing grants for communities to be able to work with those funds immediately, whether it's revolving loan funds, whether it's economic development districts in their economic recovery. And in Colorado, that means the Region 10s of the world, the Region 9s of the world, San Luis Valley Development Resources Group, Southern Colorado Economic Development District, Northwestern Colorado, AG&C. Those districts received additional funding, as well as existing revolving loan funds, and then university centers, which Colorado doesn't have one, so I won't dwell on that. The other half of this 193 million for our region is for competitive grants. And that is oversubscribed right now by a margin of 3 to 1. We have been reviewing since June nearly $240 million of applications for only about $80 to $90 million of competitive grant funds that are available. And we think that by the end of this month and maybe bleeding into October a little, we will have allocated or at least designated the funds towards projects for all $193 million. And that means a lot of projects that are in review right now that are good will not get funded. And that means that demand then will bleed into our annual budget every year. And so the point I'm making at this point is I am encouraging everyone to apply for a grant with EDA regardless of funding availability, and that's where we get to the last point. But know that the demand and the competitiveness is very high in this situation where a lot of good projects just won't be funded because of funding unavailability. And that gets to the last point, which is future supplemental or additional funding in our annual budget. But a future supplemental, again, my mantra has been I'm rooting for one, but I'm betting against it. As we get closer to the election, it's less and less likely a supplemental will get passed, but it's possible. And that's why I encourage communities, if you have a priority economic development project you want to apply for, there's no reason why you shouldn't apply just because we don't know what we don't know. We don't know how our budget will change after the election. We don't know if there will be another supplemental after the election. We just don't know. So we want to work with communities as best as possible without knowing 100% of what funding might be available or might not be available. So that's just to put in a kind of a overview of budget availability and where EDA stands right now. And then we will go into the next slide. So this, just want to highlight the importance of the fact that these are your tax dollars, that the grant dollars you're applying for are your dollars. You're just reallocating them back to your community. And so that's why I think it's so important that EDA wants, when we award grants, it's based on your priorities, your projects, whether it's broadband or a business incubator or other public works construction projects, or if it's planning. And I'll get into more detail about the spectrum of the type of support we can provide in the next slide. But what I want to highlight here is basically that these blue lines from start to finish, EDA is here to help work with the community throughout that process. And it is a longer process because your idea may not necessarily be at the point of execution. And so you may need to work on a feasibility study or we may need to work through some of the requirements that EDA has in order to arrive at a point where you can implement your project. And the one thing I do want to note here as well is that EDA is myopic when it comes to economic development, and I'll admit that right off the bat. I'm the first one to admit that housing projects for workforce housing or placemaking for community development are critical components of economic development. But EDA gets audited on how many jobs were created and how many, not just jobs, but high-skilled, high-paying jobs were created as a result of the project award that was the project that was implemented. And so that's something to keep in mind for any kind of project that you work with EDA on, is that kind of requirement is going to be a hard requirement to have to meet. It's not only that your project will likely will lead to job creation, but there's a high confidence level that there will be a high skilled, high paid jobs that will result from the project. And I'll get into how you define how you change that confidence level based on community's project a little later. But for this point, I just want to make that known here. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. This is now I just want to highlight kind of the ways that EDA can partner with communities. As I mentioned, we can start at any level of ideation within a community's economic development priorities. If you have an idea, but you're not sure if it's possible to do or that it's feasible to do, EDA can partner with you to conduct a feasibility study. A lot of before pre-COVID, but even now, a lot of communities are looking at their opportunity zones and how can they develop opportunity zone prospectuses, and what are the requirements for attracting private investment into their areas. EDA can help with those sorts of discrete planning initiatives. Or if it's a feasibility study on a broadband project, you need to understand what the demand is. How would you as a community manage and operate your public broadband infrastructure? EDA can help fund those sorts of feasibility studies, planning documents. One thing I do want to note, because it kind of does fit in this, but in EDA's parlance, it doesn't, is architecture and engineering and design work. That sort of work is not in this part of the planning aspect. It's considered construction, and we'll get into that. But just as a note, planning is usually in the tens of thousands of dollars of grant, and I'll get into matching requirements and things like that. But just to kind of give a perspective of overall grant award amount, planning is usually in that tens of thousands of dollars. And then moving along that spectrum, we can do, let's say a community has done the due diligence, has done the feasibility study to say this project is a priority, this is going to really help with our economic development, whether it's a revolving loan fund, which is our one type of grant where the grant dollars actually goes into the hands of businesses in the form of loans. Or if it's a business incubator where you're helping to start up entrepreneurs in the area that want to create jobs from within their local community. Or if it's a workforce development project where you're helping to train community members in a skill set that is in demand in your area, but is being hired from outside of your area because the skill set doesn't exist. And so you have that relationship with whatever that industry is to be able to develop the skill set for it. So bottom line is these are projects that don't require construction. They may require equipment purchase, but they may require operational expenses like staffing, leasing of space, that sort of operational costs. And so that's usually in the hundreds of thousands of dollars of grant requests. And then at the end of that spectrum, and sometimes construction happens before operations, so it's not necessarily at the end of the spectrum. It is when it comes to grant request amount though, because this is usually our higher end grant requests in the $1 to $3 million range. And that's where we're doing architecture and design and engineering design, helping to support a community in doing that, and doing construction and purchasing equipment as well for projects that are related to public infrastructure. And so I want to take an example, because this is most likely where a lot of broadband projects would be housed. Not always, but most likely. And just give an example of what a construction project looks like. And I'm going to give the poster child example, which is not a broadband project, because I'll get into that. But I'll give the poster child example of an industrial park. You have an industrial park where a county owns the property, but sells lots to those properties to private businesses. But only 40% of the lots are sold. Other 60% can still be developed. And there are, let's say, two businesses that have approached the county saying, we want to move into the area, but we have semis that we use in transporting our product. Therefore, we can't use your industrial park the way it exists now, because there's only one entry point and we need two entry points. Well, an EDA grant can help fund the construction of a secondary road or a secondary access point or other public infrastructure that would not only benefit those two businesses who would be considered beneficiaries, because they would actually commit to creating jobs as a result of the project and moving into the area, but all other 60% of those empty lots are future development of future businesses that would benefit from that second entry point into the industrial park. And it doesn't have to be an entry point. It can be water utilities, water lines. It can be power lines, as long as it's a rural electrical cooperative. If it's Excel, that's a private company, and therefore we couldn't support infrastructure improvements to Excel. But if it's any sort of public infrastructure, then EDA can help support the community in improving it. And with the end goal always being, because we are this myopic agency when it comes to economic development, high-skilled, high-paying jobs are resulting from the project. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. So now we're talking about not necessarily the what, but the how. How does a community from start to finish work through partnering with EDA? And through this whole process, EDA should be involved. There's times when applicants submit an application without us knowing, and sometimes they're good, sometimes, but most of the time there's a lot of red flags that have come up because of the fact they didn't engage us early on, and we didn't highlight those red flags they may not have seen in the notice of funding opportunity that they used to apply for the grant. So ideally, you're communicating with either Jamie or myself early on in the process so that we can help you through the process, and also hopefully stop the process early enough if it's a project that just wouldn't be funded by EDA. So you wouldn't have to go through all the rigmarole of applying and then find out at the end that it wasn't possible. And that does happen. But let's kind of, the way I was thinking about doing this is just take a not an exact project, but just say a community, let's say, well, actually I had thought of this, let's say it's the city of Montrose in Colorado, and they want to do a project, whatever that project is, we can get into it, but they say, hey, we have this priority we want to do, we want to work on this project, and it's someone from that city within Montrose, and we talk about, well, who's the applicant? Who is actually we want to do this? Is it the city of Montrose? Is it the county of Montrose? Is it the state government? Any of those are a public entity. Is it a state school? I believe those still are considered a public entity as well. We are having some internal debate on whether public schools are public entities. But as of now, they are. Or are they a nonprofit? Are they a nonprofit that wants to, for instance, wants to do a business incubator, or a nonprofit that wants to do a workforce development training program? If it's a public entity, they can apply as the public entity and they don't need anyone else's permission. But if it's a nonprofit that's applying, then you would need to have the locally elected municipality from wherever the project's located support them in their effort, because the last thing EDA wants to do is get involved in a project that the local elected leadership is not supportive of. And so that's why the requirement exists. Now that can mean a lot of things. If you're talking about multi-county project, that would mean then the county commissioners of each of those counties. If you're talking about a statewide project, I actually have not run into that sort of application yet, but so we don't know. Is it every county commissioner in the state? Is it the governor of the state? But you need to have that level of authority over whomever's in charge of that municipality for locally elected government. So that's just something to note. Those are the two types of applicants that can apply for EDA grants: public entities or nonprofits with the support of the locally elected municipality. So let's say we get past that point. It's the city of Montrose that wants to apply, the economic development office within Montrose. So we are now talking about, okay, well, is the city of Montrose eligible? Are they? There's two ways that EDA can define eligibility. Are they able to apply for an EDA grant? If you recall, $20 to $30 million a year for 10 states, that's roughly $2 to $3 million for each state each year. That's not a whole lot of funding. And the way that EDA has supported communities in the past has been based on how distressed they are. And so that distress level is based on the economic per capita income of the project area, the area where jobs would be created and where the project would exist. That's defined by you, the applicant, but that project area and what is the per capita income compared to the national average, or what is the unemployment rate compared to the national average. And if it's a certain rate, then you would qualify based on distress. And I can get into those details if we want in the discussion, but the bottom line is there's a distress criteria. If you don't meet that distress criteria, which is the case with many communities along the Front Range, and many communities even in parts of the mountain areas of Colorado, there's possibility to still be able to partner with us through what's called special need. And special need is any number of different categories of eligibility. It could be that the project's in an opportunity zone. That would be a special need requirement. It could be that a large employer is leaving the area, and otherwise it's going to result in a number of job losses that haven't yet been reflected in the per capita income data or the unemployment data yet. And so because the community knows this and there's been a public announcement, we can get out in front of the issue with the community and start funding opportunity or economic development projects to mitigate the effects. And the example for Montrose would be Russell Stover. Russell Stover's leaving, and so what does that mean for the economy in the city of Montrose because of that? And that could be the special need criteria that's met. And that special need criteria of a large employer leaving is how we also can fund any whole community that has had a downturn in the coal economy from a loss of a coal mine or a power plant. That is also a special need criteria. And then the final special need criteria that I'll mention, because it's the one that's most applicable right now, is a federally declared disaster. And again, normally federally declared disasters like Cameron Peak fire will likely become a federally declared disaster, or very well could be, because structures have been lost. And as a result, that area could be considered a federally declared disaster, and all the counties then would be eligible. With the CARES Act, with the COVID pandemic, that's the case across the nation right now. Every county, every state in the country is eligible to partner with EDA, and that's why that's part of the reason we've seen such demand for partnering with us. That and the fact that the pandemic has really hurt the economy, deeply, and that damage to the economy is going to play out in the next 5, even 10 years. And that the silver lining to the fact that there's a federally declared disaster is that it doesn't go away just because we don't have CARES Act funding anymore. The eligibility from the economic damage that's been resulting in your community because of CARES Act, because of the COVID pandemic, that eligibility will stay until the end of time. You just, as a community, have to show that the project you're working with us on is directly connected to the COVID pandemic. When it comes to broadband, that's a pretty easy argument to make. It's a pretty easy argument to say, by improving broadband infrastructure, we're going to be able to prepare for future pandemics. We're going to be able to socially isolate better with a better capacity and more reliable capacity for broadband internet for businesses to transition from social engagement to social isolation by using the internet. So particularly for broadband projects, the argument that it's addressing the economic damage that's resulted from the pandemic, it's an easy argument to make, and it's an argument that has to be made, but it's very possible to make with broadband projects. Now, it doesn't mean there's going to be funds available, but it means eligibility is then check that box. So we get past those sort of check the box requirements on eligibility. The next conversation we would have with the community is, okay, what is the competitiveness of your application? We can't help you make your project more competitive, but we can talk to you about what is and is not a competitive application within EDA. And that's where we get into confidence level that the project will result in high-skilled, high-paying jobs. That means there's kind of two ways that a community can approach this for their project. You have to show that it's a direct correlation from the project to the job creation or retention. In many cases with the RLFs that we're funding, it's job retention for businesses that otherwise would have to shut down because they can't operate the way they're operating right now in this socially isolated environment. So it can be job retention. There are some hurdles you have to make for that. So I try to focus on job creation whenever possible, but job retention is still a plausible metric as well. But regardless of the type of job retention or creation, the ability to relate to a reviewer how likely the jobs would result from this project is based on one of two things. The highest confidence level to do this is, as I mentioned, the beneficiaries from the prior example of the industrial part. If you have 1, 2, or 3 beneficiaries of businesses saying the proverbial "if you build it, we will come," meaning businesses that will commit to signing a form saying, yes, if this project were implemented, we would be able to expand by X employees, and we would commit our own private investment by X amount of dollars. For construction project, that's a requirement. You have to have at least 1 beneficiary for any construction project. And we'll talk about that when it comes to broadband, because it's it's somewhat, I would think, farcical when you're talking about broadband projects that jobs wouldn't be created as a result of it. So we'll talk about that. But by and large, though, that is a requirement for EDA, and you should be aware that you have to at least do that for construction project. But even if it's not a construction project, let's say it's equipment purchase that doesn't require any sort of construction, you still would want to have a beneficiary identified or multiple beneficiaries identified, because that will help make the competitiveness of your application that much stronger. But in addition to having a beneficiary, there's going to be jobs that you just are not going to know are going to be created, because the project is not necessarily identified the jobs that would be created from the businesses that would be supported from this. There's a broader analysis involved, because EDA allows communities to count jobs created 9 years from the start of their grant. So at year 9, you could say there's going to be, we expect this many jobs to be created based on our beneficiaries, plus our objective third-party analysis on this issue. Let's say it's a workforce development project, and the community is going to be training 50 students every year, and there are 4 businesses in this industry that will commit to hiring those trainees directly. But there may be 5 or 6 total businesses in the area, and they may end up saying, oh yeah, these are great training programs, but I didn't know that until after I saw the program in place. And so you have some sort of analysis where you talk about the estimate of how you're arriving at your total job creation numbers. And so it's a softer estimate because it's done based on an analysis of some sort. You could do an in-plan model. You can do comparison to other projects you've done in the past. You could do an analysis of just the economic environment and demand for instance, nursing is a very high demand program. It's high skilled, high paying. So it's pretty clear that if there's any project relating to health field and high skilled, high paying job creation in that area, it's going to be easy to make the case within rural communities, the demand for healthcare workers. At least I've seen that in the past. And so that's the other way you can help improve the competitiveness of your application, is having that analysis, because you have to defend that in your application. And then finally, I keep bureaucracy in here because we are a federal government. You can see as I've been talking, there has been a lot of requirements that I've been going over. But the reason for that is being good stewards of taxpayers' dollars. We have to make sure that these funds, and Congress is actually the one that wants to make sure, and your elected representatives are making sure these funds are being used as intended, and that they're your tax dollars, so you want them to be fairly, utilized. And so that's the reason why this bureau actually exists. And we try our best to help you navigate through the process, but it will exist. And that's why I also say federal agencies are definitely the funders of last resort, because there is so much more you have to go through. And leave it at that. Let me make sure there's anything else I wanted to touch on in this area. Oh, what I did want to say just before moving on to the what I think is the money slide, actually not the money bag slide, but the next slide, is the process. Just so I've talked about some of the requirements, but just to kind of give you a sense of timeline and process overall for any project, you would be working with myself or Jamie in this beginning stage and helping to draft, and we'd be reviewing drafts, and we'd be giving you feedback on red flag issues. That process can take as much time or as little time as you want. And I know there's folks on the line here that have done that process in a couple of months, and there's folks that are doing it in multiple months. And so it's up to the applicant to decide how long that process takes. But once they get into the point of submission of an application, that's where, and the reason I can be involved at this stage with you, and Jamie can be involved at that stage with you, is because we don't have any official say in the actual decision. We represent your project to the review committee. We will answer questions. So we're going to be the experts of the project for the review committee, but we cannot, we are not a deciding factor. We are only kind of your advocate, your cheerleader of sorts in the application review process. And that process, then a review committee, though, of my colleagues looks at the application. But before they do, there's a technical review that goes through. And so assuming that you've checked all the boxes, that technical review happens within a couple of weeks. And then within about a month from the time you submit is a merit review. And that's when the review committee looks at your application and decides whether we want to, what we call merit further consideration. And that's what you want to hear, because the other answer is denied, and you don't want to hear that. In that process, so that can be up to 30 days from the time that you submit. With the CARES Act applications, we've totally missed that mark. And the reason why is we've wanted to bring in all applications and review them wholly as opposed to piecemeal. And so we've been reviewing them, and we're about to end that entire phase by the end of this month. But generally speaking, 30 days from submission to merit review. But then let's say you get to the point where we want to fund the project. That's when we transition the project to a project officer, and that's when a project officer will work with you to dot the I's, cross the T's, and get to a point where an award can be made, where EDA can announce the award to members of Congress, can then make a public announcement, and then you can manage the project at that point, once that public announcement. That process, though, can take anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks from the time the review is conducted. So all told, it's between 2 and 4 months from the time you submit to the time that you should receive an award. And again, this is caveating that CARES Act applications have not abided by this. Some applications have come in June, and they're still waiting to hear what the decision of the review committee is, let alone moving into the award phase. So there has been a slowdown because of the huge demand. And so I'll leave it at that for overall process. Okay, so this is now getting into why have I been talking the last 6 slides for this slide. And this is getting into now broadband in particular. How can communities partner with EDA? How best to? What does it look like to partner with EDA when it comes to broadband? As you know, as I mentioned, our goal for all partnerships with communities at the end of the day is that the project will result in job creation and private investment and for your community. That's the #1 metric that we utilize. But the other thing to note here for the goal is that it has to be public infrastructure. It has to be, so what that means for a broadband project, let's say that it's a construction project and you want to, the community wants to connect from county A to county B. That infrastructure, while you can lease the infrastructure to private ISP providers, we have to know that it's a competitive process that you're going to conduct to, because in that sense, that would be considered a pass-through. And so that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is when we talk about job creation in broadband projects, there's kind of 2 ways to look at it based on the type of broadband project. If you're talking about connecting disparate areas that haven't had broadband before, so I'm going to use the example for Southwest Colorado, connecting Cortez to Tawak, which is a project that has been working with with the Southwest COG and with the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe on. They are connecting areas that have not had access to broadband. So that is almost like a foregone conclusion that jobs will be created from it. That being said, they still have to find a beneficiary. They have to have at least one beneficiary to check that box. And that's okay. EDA understands that. EDA, and let me, with Custer County, I know that working with them months ago, they worked with a broadband expert to develop an analysis of how many jobs would be estimated to be created as a result of their broadband cellular tower project. And they were able to use that as an analysis, and then they found one beneficiary and they were able to check that box. And that was also an example of, a project that neither have been awarded, so these are just projects, that communities are gaining access to broadband. Huge difference between that and, let's say, a particular city that wants to improve its broadband infrastructure internally. It already exists, but they want to improve it. At that kind of, when you're going from point A to point B within a city, if you're not expanding the access in any way necessarily, but you're improving reliability, you're improving capacity, then we're going to need to be a little more, there needs to be definitely more focus on finding those beneficiaries that are directly correlated to the project, because it is such a discrete, smaller project. It's not hitting as broad an area of community. So that's just something to think about, and we'll work with you depending on the type of project of how much that plays into your work. But everyone's going to have a beneficiary for a construction project. Okay, so that's kind of getting into the goal, getting into types of projects. This can span, the whole spectrum that I talked about earlier. It can be feasibility studies on a broadband project. It could be IRU acquirement. It could be equipment purchasing. It could be actual construction of fiber, of cable, of cellular towers. So it can be anywhere along that spectrum. Most of them have been in the construction line, but they don't have to be. And so I just want to let that, And then as a result, the average kind of grant request, it varies. I would say for planning, it may be even less than 200,000 potentially. But for construction, it definitely is going to reach that 3 million, which is usually our average max for construction projects. And so what that means is, because that gets into match requirement, and I won't go into too much detail, but what I will say is 50% is usually our match rate. That's our usual match rate. It will depend based on your eligibility if there's a different match rate to calculate, but just as a general rule of thumb, if a project's a $10 project, then your request to EDA is going to be $5, and then you're going to need to find match for $5. For construction, 99.9% of the time, that's cash match. It's really difficult to use in-kind match when you're talking about construction. It's not impossible, but it's really difficult to prove that and to work through that. But that means then, EDA may be doing a component of a larger broadband project. We may only be funding one component of the overall project because the project may be tens of millions of dollars. And so we may be only doing a small part of it. And I know Michelle's on, Region 10 is a perfect example of EDA playing a small part of a very massive broadband network that they orchestrated. And we just helped provide some of the equipment for, which is I'm stealing my own thunder for item 6. But before I get to item 6, I want to talk about hard requirements. With any construction project, there are two things that are going to be at cost to the applicant that you can't embed into the grant request. These are costs that you have to absorb. There are preliminary engineering report and environmental assessment. And the reason why is that for the preliminary engineering report is that you have to have a strong enough competence level within your community, whoever the applicant is, to be able to say, this is what the cost of the project's going to be. For a construction project, that usually happens when you start getting into the engineering and design of it. But you can't do that until you get the grant award. So you need a preliminary engineering report to understand how much is the cost of the project going to be. And it's on the risk is on you as how in depth you go into that PER, that preliminary engineering report. You have to have a certified engineer or architect do it. And so there's a cost that is associated, but that's to help you understand as an applicant how much you should request to EDA in the first place. And so that PER is requirement. It's as important as the main application forms are when it comes to construction projects. And then environmental assessment, because we have to abide by environmental laws, and we have to make sure that a NEPA is part of the process for any construction project. And so kind of these requirements are also part of the reason why, at the end of the day, the easiest way to partner with EDA on broadband from my perspective, and I'd love to hear from other folks that may have worked with EDA in the past too, is to do equipment purchase. You have to prove the equipment is market value. You have to make sure that you're not sole sourcing with one company for the equipment. But the amount of bureaucracy involved with doing that and following those procurement guidelines is minuscule compared to the amount of bureaucratic federal requirements there are for any construction project that we do. And you don't have to involve Davis Bacon at that level. You don't have to ensure that whomever does the preliminary engineering report for you isn't, because they're going to be precluded from following on and competing on the full award because they were involved in the application phase. And you don't have to worry about that sort of issue. And it's usually a much faster process. We still need to know that equipment isn't equipment to nowhere, that it's part of a larger project. So we still need to know that the community has funding to do the construction, has funding to do all the installment of the equipment. But when it comes to getting the most bang for EDA's buck, I would say for EDA's processes, equipment purchases when it comes to broadband are the easiest way to partner with this. We still have all those requirements of making sure that it's a public infrastructure and that it's not a pass-through to a private company and that sort of thing, but it's much less stringent when it comes to requirements for full construction projects. And so with that, I'll move to the next slide, but I'll move back up here for questions because this slide is for mine and Jamie's contact information. And I'll switch back if you want to, for folks to if they need to jot this information down, but I'm going to leave it here just until, at least for the first round of questions, because this may help spur some additional questions. And that's it.
Thank you, Trent. I can't thank you enough. That was one of the questions in the box was, does this guy breathe? Because you covered a lot of ground in a very short period of time, but you met my 45-minute at the second. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
We got a question that I want to share with you from one of our viewers. How does a feasibility study correlate with the project competitiveness, since any substantial benefits are unknown until after the study is done?
So I'm going to give an example. Well, one of the so the due diligence that a community may need to show that a project, like for instance, there are beneficiaries that you can identify, and that's the best way for competitiveness. But you may need to do an assessment or analysis of that job creation just based on data without the application. So the feasibility study may be, is it possible to do? But a component of the scope of work within the feasibility study may be, what do we expect to be the benefit? And let's invest in a university doing an in-plan model for this project, and control for all factors except for this project, to try to understand what sort of jobs would result from it. So what I would say is, communities they don't need to fund EDA funding to do a feasibility study to do that. If they can have the ability to do that analysis and to persuade reviewers that there's been a good objective analysis done to show that jobs will be created from the project, they don't have to do a feasibility study, but that may help them in the long run. When it comes to business incubators, that's a perfect example of, we just don't know. We have no idea until we start supporting the entrepreneurs. But you can do a study to determine what's the demand for entrepreneurship support in your area. What's the supply of entrepreneurs coming in, day out, because you're going to be funding this project, until the end of time. After you get the grant, you need to know what the sustainability is. So what's your program? What is the process for sustaining it? And so those sorts of questions play out also with broadband. How will you manage the broadband network? What's the process you'll do for competing ISP providers? There are lots of questions that you may want expert advice on doing, and that's where we can help fund with feasibility on that kind of side of it. Don't have to wait for EDA to do that, just helps to have
that, right? So kind of in that stumbling block category, Trent, I want to go back to something you said. Do you think that some folks do stumble in understanding in how that partnership with EDA works, and in coming to the application with a preliminary engineering report or environmental assessment? Do you think most folks just think, oh, that'll be part of the process that I'll go through? And have you seen that as a singular sort of stumbling block in, that 2 to 4 month process of working with you?
Yeah, I've seen the biggest stumbling block with any construction project, regardless if it's broadband or not, is the understanding, especially in rural areas, that whomever is working on the preliminary engineering report is going to be precluded from the follow-on award for full design and engineering because of the fact that they're involved in the application. So just a rule of thumb, any private entity that is involved on the front end of an application is going to have information that any potential bidder wouldn't have, and therefore would be precluded from being able to even bid on the project. And so that's something that I get a lot of requests from private entities saying, we want to talk about this project. And I said, we can, but know that may bar you from being involved in the back end.
And I can imagine how difficult, Trent, that is for very small communities. I mean, that's one of the things I would almost lob back to you guys to say, the communities that you want to support the most have the fewest amount of these types of resources. Sort of, if they're trying to do a homegrown, application, they just don't have that diversity in those engineering companies and design companies.
No, they don't. And that's why there's maybe only one local engineering company that can do the PER and do the full-on project. And that's a huge challenge. And I agree. It is, because we run into it more often than not. And whatever the solution is, I don't know, but I know that maybe it is something that we should, however, it's something that would require federal procurement procedure to be ultimately changed.
Right.
There are ways. I mean, the ways that very rare instances, but it has happened, was that the community abided by federal procurement processes when hiring the company to do the initial PER, and therefore they were competitively bid for the project, and thus can apply. But a lot of times communities don't know to do that, and they already have an engineer on contract from 5 years ago.
Yep, that's a good point. I mean, if you don't take anything away from this webinar other than that, competitively bid your preliminary engineering design and assessment. Then that protects you from that, one source type of complaint later on.
And EDA still needs to review that process, but that gives us an opportunity to say, yep, you did it. They had every opportunity, everyone had every opportunity to bid on that.
Above board.
They should stay.
No, I'm a bean counter, Trent. I know those accountants like that tick and tie everything. I want to open it up just in case folks weren't comfortable typing things into the chat and still have a question for Trent. Please unmute yourself and you can proceed with a question. And I'm going to give it a beat, so that you can jump in. I can't believe. No questions from the audience? That's not possible. One more beat. Okay, well, I have more questions. So if, I appreciated that you started, Trent, with the overwhelming applications that you have received. I want to hear, it clearly, and I want everybody to walk away from this, but you're still saying, please apply, because there are opportunities in the next fiscal period even for those applications to be considered, right? I didn't misunderstand that. Even though you've received 2 or 3 times the amount of applications, some that you have to fund, some of those could fall out, and some of those then also could roll over into the next fiscal funding period?
So yes, the CARES Act funds, we have $240 million of applications currently under review for $80 million of funds available. So that's going to be, I'm pretty confident those are going to be awarded and allocated by the end of this month. What I don't know is if there's another supplemental, and no one knows that. Just to put it in perspective, EDA has really become a disaster economic recovery agency over the last 4 or 5 years. Before COVID, with the floods in the Plain States, with the hurricanes, the congressional supplementals, our average annual budget for the country, just to kind of put it in perspective, is $300 million for EDA just as a standard year budget. But the supplementals that have come in from past disasters have been in the billions of dollars for those disasters. That indicates to me that the COVID pandemic, even if it's 5 months from now, there may be an additional disaster supplemental for longer term economic development projects. The CARES Act was intended to be immediate. That's why we spent half of the funding that we received on existing grants to get funds into mostly revolving loan funds and potentially new revolving loan funds, because that's a way to get funds directly into businesses that need it right now. That being said, just as understanding how disaster supplementals have passed in the past, I would expect there would be more supplementals post-election once things simmer down on the electoral front, and there would be a need for additional funding to help strengthen our economy again.
Right.
So that's why I know as soon as I say, no, we have no more funds, don't apply for anything, that's when we'll receive additional funds, and then I'll have to, mea culpa. Right. So that's why there is a risk, and I want to make sure it's known. It's going to be a very competitive process, but it doesn't mean that we can't, if we don't fund it, the initial application, when funding does become available, I'll be there to say, hey, you guys should resubmit now because there's funding available.
And I honestly think that's very unique, Trent, in the federal funding mechanisms. Typically, you have a window, it's open, it closes, and they're either first come, first serve, or who qualifies with the highest number of points. And then they're all thrown out, and next year you have to start again. So that's why I think it merited the moment to be able to have that conversation that if I put an application in that is a viable application, it ticks all the boxes, dots the I's and crosses the T's. As additional funding becomes available, it has the opportunity to be considered for those additional funds. It doesn't get thrown out.
It does. I do want to say, because it is probably a requirement that we would have to resubmit, but it wouldn't be too difficult to do. And I can be act as a communication with those communities. So we won't forget about you for sure. It will be something that you can bring back in. I can bring back in and let folks know, hey, if you resubmit under this grant, we can, I'm going to share my screen again. So
please do. Yeah, you saw that in the chat too. Great. Everybody's wanting your contact information. So while we're on that, Trent, I wanted to make sure I heard something correct. I know it's a 50% match, and that, you know, cash is king. I get that. But what we're seeing across the United States and in Colorado is so many of our local governments are partnering with their departments of transportation to be able to leverage investments in their communities along highways, you know, primary freight routes and secondary freight routes. The departments of transportation are investing heavily in fiber along those routes. Have you seen, and have projects been successful with recognition of the value of rights of way as a match for EDA grants? Because, you know, that's something that we're seeing in the bartering and trading of broadband development and trades with the departments of transportation.
Yeah, I know there's one project in particular that's doing that right now. One of their rights of way they're giving to DOT or lines, one of their lines they're giving to DOT so that they can have the right of way. And we actually discussed it internally, and I don't think we made the decision yet because that application is still under review. But I think the understanding is if that's the market rate for that, then it's a viable transaction. It's a viable transaction. It can be considered as part of the project cost. And then what that means, if it's used as match, that could be potentially as well, the value of that. But you've got to then determine what is that value, because if you're just transacting between the two, how do you know what the value is? And so that you just need to understand what that would be. I would say that the one thing that your question also spurred that I want to highlight is because match can be in kind, but obviously, as you mentioned, cash is king. That definitely is the case. However, one thing I want to also note is the kind of match, the source of match. It can be anything other than other federal dollars. And so as long as it's, you know, if the Department of Transportation, the state Department of Transportation is involved, they're not using DOT dollars, U.S. DOT dollars, then that might, you know, their involvement could be involved, they could be involved in some way, shape, or form. But that's where U.S., you know, in the beginning when we talked about USDA, we have to make sure that whatever component that our project is involved, it's unrelated to other federal dollars. Yeah, they can be part of a bigger project. It just can't be combined into the same project, because we can't double dip, so to speak, with federal dollars. Understood.
So I'm going to throw out something, you know, kind of a what if. So we recognize that COVID has had a, you know, there's going to be before and there's going to be an after in all of our timelines, you know, as a nation collectively. And what we all were accepting before COVID is that if we really needed high capacity broadband connections, we could go to work, or the kids could go to school, or what have you, right? And now what we're seeing after, you know, BC and you know, post COVID, well, we're not exactly post yet, but you know what I mean? We need this connectivity today. We need this. Are you seeing, have you seen, or do you anticipate seeing applications for your program that would say, my community wants to deploy broadband, you know, a very dense fiber broadband connectivity throughout our city, because we know we are not going to get 5G if we aren't an NFL city. And so we know to bring those folks that want to move from the urban areas and telework and be able to live in a community that has the advantages of, you know, 5G technologies, could they use that as a reason and a purpose for applying for these grants if they can show that they would entice more people to live in their communities, thus creating jobs through the spending that those folks that move in spend in grocery stores and restaurants and things of that nature? They're actually seeding money to develop the core of that community's economic development in investing in those types of technologies that facilitate a greater quality of life in those communities. Have you seen any of those yet? Or are you anticipating maybe getting some?
Well, so a lot of communities I haven't been able to partner with until now because those communities weren't distressed until now based on a federally declared disaster, the pandemic. So yes, I've had lots of conversations. The challenge is that some of EDA's requirements for not being a pass-through to private entities. For instance, a lot of communities have developers in the area where they want to expand their broadband. And those developers are rightfully, they want to sell the property once the values increase in that property to private businesses and things like that. But because the city doesn't own that property and it's a developer that owns the property, if a broadband project will be put in, you're all of a sudden adding value to private property. And we would, in that sort of situation, we require the property owners to do a property owner agreement, not to sell their post-accrued value for at least 20 years. And no developer is going to want to rightfully.
Oh, no. Yeah, and I'm with you there, and I totally get it. But what would entice AT&T or Verizon to come to a rural community to put the towers in, those little 5G towers, is if the city owned and operated a fiber infrastructure that they could connect to. They would not be turning that over to AT&T or Verizon. It's just that fiber creates the backhaul for that 5G.
That would be fine, because that's what private entities do after that public infrastructure is installed is up to them to do. We're not involved in that in any way. So that's totally the market's purview to do that. And if that helps spur that, because we have a fiber system that's in place that's owned and managed by the city. Yeah, no, 100%. That's a decision communities need to make if they want to own and manage that. An example of a community that I had worked with, but they decided ultimately not to, is Glenwood Springs. They have a great network that's owned and operated by the city, but they decided at the end of the day not to apply for the EDA because there were a lot of requirements, and for one reason or another, maybe it was competitive, they decided not to. But 100% answering your question, yeah, I don't see that as being any stipulation or problem, prohibition from EDA supporting community, because of the fact that they're doing it to help their economic growth in their region, the capacity that wasn't there, the reliability that wasn't there. They have to make those cases, but those are cases that can be made and are pretty standard across communities. That argument can be made in northwestern Colorado, and can be made in southwestern Colorado.
Everywhere.
Same argument.
Other than the NFL cities, we're not going to get it any other way, not 5G. It has to have fiber. So I have one more question from the audience. Would the renegotiation of a municipality's utility fiber easement to allow commercial broadband use be a valid project type?
So you're saying that the municipality would purchase or acquire right-of-way use? Is that what you're saying? Well,
Eric, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself and jump in. I don't know how to explain this to Trent better than I think that you would, Eric.
Sure. Thank you very much. The scenario is that the city currently has a right-of-way utility easement that crosses 3 property owners that the city paid a fair amount of money to get in place a number of years ago, but it only allows government use. And there's pent-up demand in the area that the fiber terminates in a large commercial and residential development. There's pent-up demand for additional broadband availability for ISPs in this area. So the idea would be to renegotiate this government-only utility fiber easement to allow for commercial broadband use as well. And it could cost more money to these property owners that the current easement process.
Okay, so it could cost more money on the municipality's side to have to negotiate these.
Exactly.
Okay.
Pay off the owners.
Just so I understand, you have public infrastructure, broadband infrastructure in place, but
correct,
private ISPs cannot utilize that line based on the agreement. I don't know. I've never run into this issue. The concern would be if there's only one ISP provider that you are negotiating it for, that would be a pass-through. But if you're doing it for any potential ISP provider that would be competitively bid, maybe that could be. That would be an interesting question and something I'm happy to follow through with you on after this to talk to our legal counsel as well, because I haven't run into the example before, so I just don't know.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. I'll follow
Well,
up.
thank you, Eric. Yeah, I appreciate that. And we'll make sure that you've got Trent's contact information. Just to kind of wrap up, I always like this, Trent, to say at the end, what are the biggest challenges? You're the expert. What are the biggest challenges that you've seen communities face when they're pursuing an EDA broadband grant? What do they trip up on? What are they not seeing? What are the things that you think are the biggest challenges?
So I would say the biggest challenges are understanding what EDA can and can't fund when it comes to construction projects. It's got to be purely construction and engineering and design. It can't be funding other kind of costs associated with the project, but not part of the project. Because when it comes to construction, we're talking about hourly rates. We're talking about really getting down to we're talking with engineers. So it's black and white to an engineer. There's no fuzzy gray. And so that is one of the challenges, and the importance of the PER and following that PER, because it is a prescriptive approach. That's one. The other, and I'm not an expert in broadband at all, so I can help facilitate through this. And our engineer has experience with broadband more and more, but again, wasn't trained on broadband projects. The same is the case with applicants. Delving their feet into the broadband world and utilizing public municipalities to manage and operate broadband networks. That's new for them as well. And so having that technical expertise, and whether it's through contracting with a technical expert or doing that sort of technical assistance that EDA can help fund, so that communities do have a really well understanding approach to how they're going to do the broadband project. That I think is something also. And I know OEDIT in the state has a really strong broadband office, and they are also advocates. And so those are some of the off the bat kind of challenges that I've seen. And otherwise, there's some of these challenges doesn't matter if it's broadband or if it's just construction in general. There's a lot of hoops to jump through.
Well, I really appreciate your time. I want to leave you though with the last word, Trent. So, what would be your summary statement to our audience? We had a very good turnout today for this. Everyone's interested in the programs that EDA has, not USDA. And they really, this is one of our largest turnouts. And so I want to give you the opportunity for the last word on EDA and your program.
Sure. What I will say is what is in the realm of possible. So even if you don't have an idea set in stone, because we can help partner all along that spectrum, reach out to myself and Jamie, and we can work with you to say, here's what is possible, here's what's not possible. If you had asked me what to say maybe a month ago, I wouldn't have said this because my day was just packed. But we're starting to see a little bit of daylight, and we're starting to see a little more white space on the calendar. So I want to make sure communities know to reach out to us to talk about their ideas and their projects, because we want to partner with them. Again, I say this all the time, but I'm going to repeat it: it's your tax dollars, that your priorities, and so we want to make sure that we're helping to coordinate as best as possible how we can partner with you to achieve those priorities. So that's what I'll say.
Well, and my charge is to make sure that Colorado gets its unfair share of federal funding. So I want to work with you and our ISPs. Thank you to our audience for joining us today and participating. We're doing this for you, and so we want to provide you with content that's valuable to you. So we thank you. Thank you, Trent, for your time. Thank you for sharing your contact information for both you and Jamie. And we look forward to getting some more of EDA's dollars and investments in economic development for the state of Colorado. Thank you, everyone.
Can I just say one more thing?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Thank you in the broadband office. The state's broadband office has done amazing work in coordinating throughout the state. And I'm going to put a plug in for your panel next week with Colorado funders, because I think that's going to be a slam dunk of a success of talking about how rural broadband can be implemented throughout the state. So I really appreciate the fact that your office exists and that you've partnered so well with federal, state, and local communities, and we look forward to continuing to partner with you.
Well, we thank you. Thank you for the plug. Have a great day, Trent. Thank you, and thank you to our audience. We will see you next month on our next month's Lunch and Learn.
Thank you.